Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with another episode of the Chaos Dwarf Q&A. Let's not waste any time and get straight into it. We're going to be finishing the design/meta questions today and heading into some new categories. So, the first question is, I've always thought of the Chaos Dwarfs as one of the weaker factions. If that's not true, can you explain why? Ultimately, I actually hear this opinion a fair amount from people that are new to the setting, or maybe are just learning about the Chaos Dwarfs or the Warhammer Fantasy universe and kind of struggle to understand how they fit into it. But ultimately, it boils down to how you're looking at the situation. I would personally argue that the Chaos Dwarfs are one of the strongest races in the world, as they possessed one of the deadliest combinations of reliable but devastating technology. I mean, the dwarfs are incredibly impressive in warfare, and the Dawi Zharr are just dwarfs that have added monsters, flying monsters, heavy cav, magic, and hobgoblins, which allows them to field fast cavalry and lots of cannon fodder infantry. So, really, at the end of the day, their only true weakness is their numbers. But that hardly makes them one of the weaker races. Anyone who tried to wipe out the Chaos Dwarfs would be massively crippled, and a Chaos Dwarf army is well prepared to destroy forces many times larger than themselves due to their horrifically devastating weapons. I mean, ultimately, the Chaos Dwarfs are a race that have, for their entire design life, or their, as long as they've existed in the lore, which is thousands of years, they have constantly been under attack by vastly superior forces in terms of numbers, in that the main antagonists they face on a regular basis are Greenskins, Skaven, and Ogre Kingdoms, which is a really terrifying trio to go up against. And yet they have been functionally coming out on top the entire time and just growing in strength. The Chaos Dwarfs have only had a single moment in their history where they essentially were forced to take a step back, in that they kind of lost progress, and that was during the Black Orc Rebellion. But with that one hiccup aside, which was caused by their own machinations, they have just been continuously going up and up and up, and just slowly expanding their population, and also constantly inventing new and more terrifying forms of weaponry. So, I mean, if you're looking at it from a pure, okay, I'm gonna take every faction in a vacuum and take their entire race and not worry about any of the logistics and just have, like, all the Chaos Dwarfs put on a magical battlefield against all of everybody else, then yeah, I could see the argument of them being the weakest race. But I feel like that's kind of a ridiculous way to look at them. When you take into consideration everything about them, then I think per pound they're the strongest race, or at least one of the strongest races, but their big weakness is that they don't have a lot of poundage. So hopefully that can offer an interesting, or a different perspective on that. Obviously, trying to rate the races in like an objective fashion I think is impossible. We just don't have enough information, and there's a lot of subjectiveness that's going to come into it as far as like how you think certain situations would go down. But if you ever asked me like who's the weakest race, I don't know that I would ever be able to make an answer that I would find satisfactory, because I think depending on how you define that contest, it's going to change, depending on just so many facets. But, hopefully that answers that. Let's move on. How do I think Creative Assembly will represent in-game the system of how Chaos Dwarfs tend to turn into stone? That's a great question. I honestly think this may be represented by a special debuff that exists for their miscast system, where perhaps if a Chaos Dwarf miscasts, they take much more damage than normal, but perhaps they gain a increase to their armor stat that lasts for the rest of the battle. This could be a clever thematic mechanic that also makes for interesting gameplay, as miscasting could potentially be useful early on in a battle, as it gives you some extra defense to your sorcerer, but it could become much more terrifying at lower levels of health because there's a chance you could just accidentally off your own sorcerer. Personally, I would really like miscasting to be capable of dealing much more damage in general, honestly, to make people pretty scared about it, to make overcasting kind of a big deal, and make those items and abilities, which increase the enemy miscast chance, to be much more impactful, which is something that I'm going to be talking a lot about in the near future, which you'll all see soon. But yeah, because right now there's essentially like a random meter for how much damage a miscast can do. It can do a little damage or a lot of damage. But for the Chaos Dwarfs, I would just up both sides of that, so it can do a higher minimum and a higher maximum. But when they miscast, they get a permanent buff. I think that would be a good way to handle it and kind of have it represented without having to bust their balls on making like some crazy unique system, you know, because I'd rather them be focused on other stuff. Next question, can there be a follow-up Q&A? Yes, absolutely. We will do a live stream. Yeah, we'll make it a live stream. There will be a follow-up live stream that I do on Twitch that once it's finished will also be uploaded onto YouTube as the last episode, like the genuine last episode in the Chaos Dwarf Q&A. That way people can chat with me about it live, and I can hopefully cover anything that I missed. Though this Q&A I feel is very comprehensive. There's even slight overlaps in a few places, so I struggle to think of anything I might have missed as far as like a question goes. There have definitely been some answers that I have missed some information that I spoke about last time, but that is already going to have its own episode. If you could create a new unit for the Chaos Dwarfs, what would it be? I've spoken about him before, but personally, I would like to make my own version of the Colossus. That, I spoke about it, that it was kind of retconned slightly, sorta, as, like, the largest version of the Kadai, but I really want just a large mechanical monstrosity that just stomps across the battlefield, unleashing an impressive amount of firepower from the many crude weapon platforms it has. I think I would go with crafting this, when I'm crafting this thing, I would really want it to be, like, super creepy looking. So where you might have, like, the typical dwarfs would have, like, a rune golem or a thunder barge, I would want this to be something where the Chaos Dwarfs designed it to be terrifying. So, like, a really slow-moving, heavily armored monster with, like, bunch of creepy legs. So, like, somewhere between a spider and a bull and a demon. And just have it, like just kind of skittering its way towards you. Which, granted, I guess that could have a little bit of overlap with the Iron Demon, which is the giant train. But ultimately, I would really like to see something like a Necrofex Colossus, but slower moving, much wider rather than taller, and geared much more around shorter range weaponry that fires in like multiple directions. So maybe like a large monstrosity that fires 360, but it's mostly like flame cannons and magma guns and you know, some blunderbusses. So like lots of very heavily short range firepower, but it's very localized, kind of like a Dread Saurian, I guess. But either that, or I would just like to see another interesting variant on Chaos Dwarf infantry. I mean, that's probably like the biggest complaint a lot of people have about the Chaos Dwarfs that I think is completely justified, is that they are very, very lacking when it comes to having a diverse roster of actual Thrathzar themselves. We have already spoken in the past about like shoulder-mounted Death Shrieker rockets, the Harridans, which are like the female elite infantry that are like a bodyguard unit, the Immortals, which are like elite halberd infantry. So like, you know, seeing those guys brought in would be really fun and all that kind of stuff. Next, do I think the Chaos Dwarfs, given enough time, would ever reach our real-world technological level? And also, the person who asked this question, Hentai Haven, was like, my English is terrible. Not true, your English was amazing. So please don't apologize. As to answer your question, the Chaos Dwarf tech is already terrifyingly advanced in many, many ways. I mean, there are easily things they can do that I don't think we can do very, very well. I mean, they seem to be much craftier at harnessing like the natural power of the earth, like harnessing magma and all this other stuff. And, you know, they can use magic, which gives them some pretty terrifying advancements on us. Ultimately, I think that it would really only be a matter of time, maybe 1,000 years at most, before we would probably see, like, more accurate gene editing to, like, improve the nature of the Chaos Dwarfs themselves, or maybe try again to make a new slave race. And, you know, setting off nukes and exploring new territories like outer space and the ocean and stuff like that, which, I personally don't count him as a Chaos Dwarf, but there was a dwarf that had fallen to chaos, which there's a difference there. The ship that controlled the Black Kraken in Dreadfleet, and he, you know, that was a submersible mechanical demon thing, which sounds terrifying. So, I don't know. I genuinely think that they're nearly to our level in a lot of ways, just because magic kind of closes the gap in a lot of places that you may not necessarily think. We definitely have more advanced technology than they do, but I really feel like the Chaos Dwarfs would not be that far behind us. Alright, and that is the end of the design questions. So now we are into just a few questions relating to Age of Sigmar and the End Times. So the first question, are the Chaos Dwarfs in Age of Sigmar? If so, how did they survive and what are they up to? Yes, they are 100% undeniably in Age of Sigmar. There's a lot of them, they're very active, and they're going to be most likely playable in 3rd edition AOS. So if you've been thinking about, if you're like, man, I'd love to collect Chaos Dwarf minis, I'd even play Age of Sigmar, or maybe I like Age of Sigmar, but I want Chaos Dwarfs, you're not going to have to wait that long. As far as like what they've been up to, we have seen them in multiple books, but the last time that we really saw them in great numbers was that they have been seen operating the vast forges that produce the weapons and armor required by Archaon's legions in the 8 points. So if there was a expansion near the end of 2nd edition called The Wrath of the Everchosen, which featured Orphean Catacross and Lady Olander, who are the two of the new Mortarchs of Nagash, invaded the 8 points, which is Archaon's domain, and they started just tearing their way across it. And eventually they made it to one of the mighty forges that produces all of Archaon's supplies, and it was completely crewed and dominated by Chaos Dwarfs. So the Dawi Zharr were not only there, but they were there in massive numbers and actually fought against the armies of death and Lady Olander and Catacross, which ultimately they lost, and they were defeated and killed, and that forge was basically wiped out. But that was only one forge, and there was definitely a couple of them. At least more, like, I think there were at least 8 in the 8 points, but probably more. And that's likely not that is almost assuredly not, like, the big home base of the Dawi Zharr. That was literally just their forges to help Archaon and kind of, you know, work out their trade with him in exchange for who knows what. As for how they survived, or what they're up to on their own, outside of constantly crafting new devices, we don't really know yet. We have gotten recent confirmation that the Hobgoblins are back with the new Cruel Boys army. If you buy the Dominion starter, or it's not a starter set, but if you buy the Dominion box set for 3rd edition Age of Sigmar, which is the first release for 3rd edition, it actually comes with a unit of Hobgoblin Slitas, which are the new Hobgoblin unit, and they actually carry these hand grenades. They're literally grenades that were forged by the Chaos Dwarfs that the Hobgoblins have essentially taken with them. But we know the Hobgoblins still work for the Chaos Dwarfs in Age of Sigmar, so they are 100% confirmed. They are probably going to be playable this edition, and they are almost assuredly coming down the chute. That being said, there actually are some really interesting mentions if you read the 2nd edition battle tomes for, I think it's the Fire Slayers or the Caradron Overlords, one of the two. They actually updated the timeline so it goes a lot more into what was going on with Grudni and Grudnir when they appeared in Age of Sigmar. Because in earlier editions, we were told that Sigmar, when he was exploring the realms during the Age of Myth, he actually found Grugni and Grimnir on the tallest mountain in Shaman, chained up. And everyone was like, okay, how the hell did they get there? Well, in 2nd edition, they actually started exploring what happened, and it turns out that that actually wasn't where they woke up, which, like, a lot of the gods in Age of Sigmar basically, like, woke up and they were imprisoned, or they were just kind of wandering around until Sigmar bumped into them. And that was actually the case for Grimnir and Grugni as well, except for they were really active. So the two of them woke up in their respective realms, the realm of fire and the realm of metal, and there were Dwarden there, and they started rebuilding civilization and doing a lot of stuff, and they were super busy. And they formed a new pantheon. But the problem was something went wrong, and there was some schism. There was some conflict among this pantheon that caused the pantheon to be shattered. And it seems that the rest of, like, the minor Dwarden gods either were killed or lost. We know Gazul was eaten by Nagash later, even though he's not really dead, but, you know, what is death to a god of death, right? But this schism led to some kind of fight or grand betrayal where one of the gods did something, and the end result was that Grugni and Grimnir were imprisoned on the tallest mountain in Shaman together. And neither of them will speak on what happened. Like, Grimnir was so angry about it that when he finally got freed by Sigmar, instead of, you know, like, staying to help his people or helping rebuild civilization or doing something useful, he did the typical Grimnir thing where he was so hot-headed and pissed off about what happened that he was like, just, like, point me at the biggest monster and I'm gonna go kill it. And Sigmar was like, Volcatrix, and Grimnir and Volcatrix kamikazed and killed each other. And Grugni just refuses to talk about it. But now that Grugni is actively back, hopefully we'll get to find out what's going on there, and maybe that's Hashit, or Hashit in disguise, or maybe Hashit's not around anymore, and it's a new god who the Chaos Dwarf worship. But, we don't know a lot about them yet, but there's a lot of breadcrumbs that are leading to them, and it's just getting denser and denser and denser, and it seems like any day now they could pop out and be playable, and hopefully we'll get to figure out what the hell they've been up to. So yeah. Next question. If the Chaos Dwarfs had not been eradicated somewhat earlier in the end times, what do I think they would have done during the final years? Ultimately, the Chaos Dwarfs are probably one of the easiest races to predict because their strategy for domination was very slow and deliberate, and they would have just kept on doing what they always do, which is that they would have marched out to enslave as many people as possible and taken the end times as a good opportunity to experiment with their newest and most devastating creations. They often considered war to just be the best chance for field testing. Interestingly enough, the Chaos Dwarfs are such a material race, and Hashit cared much more about dominating the physical plane, than he did anything else. Like, he just did not care for Chaos to win in the sense that the other Dark Gods did. You know, Hashit did not seem to have an interest in Chaos devouring the planet. He wanted to control all the resources, there's a subtle difference there. But honestly, I think once the end times were fully at hand and the Chaos Dwarfs realized they were fully at hand, I think they would have had a genuine crisis on what to do. And I think it would have depended on what Hashit would have wanted. If Hashit's greed was focused purely on, I want to own the world, and the world belongs to me and no one else, it is not allowed to be destroyed, it is mine, which is very well what he would have done, may have wanted to do, the Chaos Dwarfs, I think, would have instantly turned on Archaon. I think the Chaos Dwarfs would have, I don't think they would have marched to the aid of the good guys, but I think they would have attacked Archaon and Middenheim with everything they had. And I genuinely believe they would have completely abandoned Mingolzar Nagrund and just marched on the Legions of Chaos to try and destroy them. Now, if they could have struck a bargain with Archaon and the Dark Gods, as Archaon being the representative, or maybe Hashit was able to... Because, like, we kind of saw this with the Great Horned Rat, where if you read the End Times, one of the better written things that happened is that the Great Horned Rat initially was not sided with the greater powers. The Great Horned Rat and the Skaven were doing their own thing. They were fighting everybody, including Chaos. But eventually, during Book 4 or Thanquol, it became clear to the Great Horned Rat that he could not survive what was coming if he did not join up with the Dark Brothers. Like, if they won, which he thought they were going to, he decided it would be better to be on the winning team side than try and backstab the Dark Gods and, get in on the... and try and win for himself. He decided, okay, I'm not going to be able to pull this off. They're too strong right now. So he sent Thanquol and Screech Verminking to negotiate with Archaon, and that is what joined the Skaven to the forces of Chaos and kind of unified Chaos. I think the Chaos Dwarfs probably would have done the same thing, where they would have either fought against Archaon in a bid to control everything if their greed was bigger than their survival instincts, or Hatchet would have said, no, let's rip the riches that we can from this world, and let's join up with Chaos and just go on to conquer all of reality and whatever lies beyond, in which case they would have joined up with Archaon. You could argue that they did join up with Archaon, because, technically, you could still field hail cannons and everything in the end times. They just, that was just really the only Chaos Dwarf thing. And you have to remember that the Chaos Dwarfs being wiped out wasn't like a major story beat of the end times. It was a minor note in a side book. The Chaos Dwarfs are never even mentioned. So the end times are split into... There's 5 campaign supplements, which are like the big books, where all of the really hardcore stuff happens. And those are what you could consider the canon storyline. Then they released 5 Black Library books that correspond to each of those big campaign books that kind of like focus in on specific stories and cover certain events, but they're clearly rushed because a lot of those two don't agree with each other on what happens. But it was in one of those books that, I think it was the last one, Archaon, or Lord of the End Times, where there's a part about Grimgor, and it kind of offhandedly mentions everything that Grimgor had been up to during the End Times, which included him wiping out the Chaos Dwarf Empire. So, yeah, hopefully that answers that. It was, spoilers, it was a big mess. The Chaos Dwarfs kind of just got killed off screen, and one of the authors was like, oh, I guess I should, include a note there. Alright, that's going to be it for the End Times and Age of Sigmar, so let's go on to Chaos Dwarfs Worldwide. Are there any Dawi Zharr colonies outside of the Darklands? Not that I have ever found evidence of. I'm hesitant to say completely just no, but I have never seen any evidence that the Chaos Dwarfs have ever established a colony outside of the Darklands. They are extremely cautious when it comes to expanding their empire and have a very dwarfen approach to world domination, which is to say, slow and steady wins the race. They are not out there to rush and take as many provinces as possible as quickly as possible. But yeah, I would say no. All right, this next question is probably going to be the last question because it's a big one, but maybe we'll have time for another one. But here we go. What is the relationship between the Chaos Dwarfs and the other races? Okay, so I'm just going to hit this real hard and fast because there's a lot kind of packed into this question that we answer more in other sections, and I don't want to be here forever. Like, some of the, like, specific things in here, people are like, oh, what do the Chaos Dwarfs and the Elves feel? And I feel like we've already answered that in, like, the culture section, and there's some, like, oh, well, how about trade? Well, we answered that in a later question, so for this one, I'm just going to talk about, like, the relationship between all of the playable factions and the Chaos Dwarfs. Here we go. So, the Empire. The Chaos Dwarfs do not know a lot about the Empire, as they rarely come so far west. To the extent that, like, to the Chaos Dwarfs, the Empire is kind of a mysterious land that they hear things about from, you know, caravans that, like trade caravans they capture or slaves or what have you, but they don't really go there super often because it's super out of their way. But from what few interactions that they've had, the two races are always extremely unfriendly. There has never been a happy incident between the two. And as far as the Empire is concerned, the Chaos Dwarfs are so rare that to a significant amount of, a staunch majority of the Imperial citizens, the Chaos Dwarfs are a myth. They're not real. Dwarfs, eternal enemies who don't fight one another as much, as both nations spend most of their time attempting to expand their own territories or just defending what they have against constant assaults from others. You know, the dwarfs really don't like to go on grand escapades and campaigns. That usually doesn't go well, and in their history they kind of view it as a waste of resources. Similarly, the Chaos Dwarfs really don't have the desire to go west and fight the dwarfs just for the hell of it. They're both, you know, they absolutely despise each other, but they're kind of more focused on dealing with their own crap. High Elves. Very rarely do the High Elves and the Chaos Dwarfs bump into each other, but I would say they run into each other probably more often than the Empire does. And they are definitely hard enemies. Elf slaves are a very rare resource, and the Icer do not take kindly to Chaos races, especially as they kind of view themselves as the, you know, the protectors of the planet, and they're one of the more dominant, they are the dominant naval faction, and the Chaos Dwarfs do have a fleet that likes to go out and try and capture slaves and stuff, and they have absolutely run into each other a number of times. When they actually introduced a number of Chaos Dwarf missions in various books, and a lot of those missions, the High Elves end up being one of their opponents. But yeah, no, they do not get along, and they've run into each other probably more than people think, but yeah, it's never friendly. They don't get along. Norsca. Most Norskins are very reluctant, but willing to barter with the Chaos Dwarfs for superior weapons and armor. Many, if they want to become Chaos Champions or Ascend, make that journey to acquire Chaos Armor, which many people get their Chaos Armor from the Chaos Dwarfs if they do not receive it from the Dark Gods as a blessing in and of itself. Wulfric the Wanderer actually sacked a mining outpost fortress little thing known as Drongnakul, and he killed the Thane, which is Thegen, that was ruling over it. But generally, when it comes to the Norskins and the Chaos Dwarfs, it just depends on the tribe and what's going on, and when it comes to like how they're going to handle that relationship. Some Norskins are much more insular and think that they should like be living off the land, or like they should acquire everything through raiding and never through trading. And others are maybe a little more diplomatic with that relationship. But if you want to read about that relationship, if you actually pick up Wulfric's Black Library book, which is a fantastic book, there's an entire series of chapters dedicated to him attacking the Chaos Dwarfs and talking about the relationship between those two races. Warriors of Chaos, easily the biggest ally to the Chaos Dwarfs and the most common trading partner. And while they tend to be allies, I would not call them trusted allies, but many Chaos Lords really want Dawi Zharr in their armies. But at the same time, there are a number of Chaos Lords who try and prove themselves to the gods, try and prove how powerful or hard or whatever they are by actually killing Chaos Dwarfs, so like going after them. That has never ended well. that generally does not go too good. That's why places like the Black Tower exist, or the Black Fortress, where Drasyleth the Ashen is. Dark Elves. I have never read about a recorded meeting between these two. I would say enemies at worst, rivals at best. They both are very reliant on slave economies, though the way they treat or rely on their slaves is very different. Well, not super different, but different enough. I don't think they would necessarily get along, because I don't think neither the Dark Elves or the Chaos Dwarves want to trade away their slaves in return for something else. But I could see the Dark Elves being open to it if they really wanted something from the Chaos Dwarfs. Say if there was a particular Dark Elf who maybe has seen the engineering of the Chaos Dwarfs before, and he really wants them to forge him something, or like acquire some gobbledygook, then I could absolutely see them parlaying. These two would definitely be able and willing to negotiate with one another, but I think they would still not get along, especially because they're both so like hilariously arrogant. Wood Elves. I don't think anybody but the dwarfs hates the Chaos Dwarfs as much as the Azrai would. The Dawi Zharr are the absolute worst polluters in the world. And they cause insignificant damage to the weave, which is kind of like the natural life of the planet, of nature, on the Warhammer world itself. And yeah, I think, I don't even know if I think maybe just because of the history, the Wood Elves would still hate the Beastmen more, but it wouldn't be by a lot. I think the Wood Elves would utterly despise the Chaos Dwarfs. And the Wood Elves would probably be an absolute nightmare for the Chaos Dwarfs to deal with, frankly. As they are not a force that is usually easy to just, like, draw up your siege lines to start firing at, because they're skirmish fighters and ambushers, which the Chaos Dwarfs do not appreciate. So, yeah, I don't think they would be, yeah, no, it would be bad. Bretonnia. Chaos Dwarfs are practically violating every single line in the Code of Chivalry, and would be despised on a fundamental level, thanks to their love of war machines and shooting. No recorded meetings that I've read about, but undoubtedly these two have met on battlefields before. Maybe not an entire Chaos Dwarf army, but seeing as Bretonnians for a long time really enjoyed going east during the Errantry Wars, I would not be surprised if they bumped into each other from time to time. And so, yeah. Kislev. The Kislevites have attempted and succeeded in controlling High Pass, or the High Pass, at various stages of history due to the western entrance leading straight into Kislev from the Darklands. Not to mention, that's actually originally where the Gospodars came from. And when the Gospodars made the migrant route where they left the eastern steppes and came to Kislev at the bidding of the Ancient Widow, there is zero chance that they did not run into Chaos Dwarfs, passing as close as they did to Uzkulak. No doubt these two have fought many, many times, and I'm sure Kislev has lost many noble souls to the slavery lines of the Dawi Zharr, but I have also no doubt that the Kislevites have taken their fair share of vengeance on the Dawi Zharr, and there's no doubt bitter hatred there. Daemons of Chaos. The demons don't really give a damn about the Chaos Dwarfs, seeing as their souls are already withered, corrupt things sold to Hashit at just a abysmally deep level. That being said, they're not fond of being imprisoned and being used as batteries, so no doubt there are demons who have been captured by the Chaos Dwarves that maybe were released because the thing they were in was destroyed, or they were contained within the demon flask and they got unleashed or whatever. And there would definitely be a very bitter revenge fantasy there. Demons do not forget, particularly when they've been insulted like that by being turned into, you know, a literal item or tool. The Lizardmen, there's no recorded meetings, but Chaos Dwarfs are definitely not part of the Great Plan and would make terrible slaves. Definitely huge enemies. I would not actually be surprised to know that the Chaos Dwarfs have probably gone to the Dragon Isles, which are just south of Darklands, but the Lizardmen there are feral. They are not normal Lizardmen because there's no Slawn still alive on the Dragon Isles, and all of the Lizardmen there apparently over the millennia have degenerated into being much more just animalistic beasts. So the Chaos Dwarfs have probably fought there before, and no likely use lizard bits as ingredients for particular things, but there's no big recorded battles between the two empires. And like the first time I think the Lizardmen ever encountered the Chaos Dwarfs, at least the Lizardmen of Lustria, was that when Vashnar the Tormentor invaded Lustria, he brought hell cannons with him, which is the first time the Lizardmen had seen anything like that. And it was super spooky for them, but lucky for them, Tic-Tac-Toe just dropped a whole bunch of rocks on it. On them, sorry. There was quite a few hell cannons, but they all got squished. Skaven. There is a huge rivalry between the Skaven of Clan Scryer and the Chaos Dwarfs. They are constantly trying to steal from one another or one-up each other, and a bitter hatred has developed due to that. I'll speak about it more in a later episode, but there's actually been some battles between the two where they've unleashed such horrifying amounts of devastation that it literally caused, like, a storm of magic to pop into existence and, like, wiped out both sides. So, there's an unpleasant relationship there. Ogre Kingdoms. Most of the ogres are fairly neutral towards the Chaos Dwarfs. They're not particularly fond of the stunted folk, but will trade with them for guns and other equipment. That being said, there are a few ogre tribes who are close allies to the Dawi Zharr. The most notable is easily the Ironskin tribe, and their tyrant, Garg Ironskin, who was such a big bro to the Chaos Dwarfs, they actually gifted him a demonically infused mechanical Rhinox to serve as a mount. And I need you to understand, a Rhinox is huge. You think a Juggernaut is big? Nah, a Rhinox is big. So imagine like a Juggernaut of Khorne, which are those armored guys riding on like the big metal rhinoceros, but like it's an ogre tyrant, mind you, so like the largest kind of ogre there is, riding on a huge Juggernaut. We're talking like in the ballpark of Stegodon-sized Juggernaut. Like, yeah. So, but for the most part, the Ogre Kingdoms don't really care about them. Some will attack the Chaos Dwarves, some trade with them. Greasus Goldtooth is noted as not being fond of them, but he has not all-out declared war on them yet. Tomb Kings. The Tomb Kings actually have a very old hatred of the Chaos Dwarf Empire. The two are not friendly. They have fought many times. The Tomb Kings actually battled against the Chaos Dwarfs when they were alive, like they were Nehekarans, and they have continued to fight them after their death and undeath. So the two sides have always had very hostile relations, and that's unlikely to change. I'm sure there are some two kings that don't particularly care, as they do tend to be more neutrally aligned, and so maybe they would be, you know, willing to negotiate with the Chaos Dwarfs, especially because a lot of the things Tomb Kings value, the Chaos Dwarfs would be happy to give them in exchange for slaves, because the Tomb Kings in general don't really care about having living slaves. They have undead slaves that do a much better job. But, you know, so there's potential there, but for the most part, they're not friendly. Vampire counts. Vampires have a long and storied history of despising anything chaos-related. And that definitely extends to the relationship with the Chaos Dwarfs. The Dawi Zharr, if they had their way, would turn the world into a wasteland of ash and fire, which the necromancers and vampires of the world would be extremely not okay with. Though I would not be very surprised if some vampires or necromancers attempted to manipulate the Dawi Zharr into being somewhat allies, or maybe they've negotiated like a little pact and traded back and forth a little bit. For the most part, I would say they would be very antagonistic towards one another. For instance, Neferata, who's probably the closest living vampire that's noteworthy to the Dawi Zharr, as she is in the Eastern World's Edge Mountains, she despises them. She just sees them as dirty little uncouth creatures. Like, Neferata does not particularly like dwarfs, but she at least kind of has like a slight respect for much of dwarven culture that she kind of picked up when she knew the dwarfs of the Silver Pinnacle before she killed them all. But the Chaos Dwarfs have nothing that Neferata would admire. They are filthy creatures that make a filthy world. That being said, though, I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a Necrarch or a Von Karstein that was willing to, you know, kind of engage in like non-aggression or something along those lines. But Lamians definitely would probably not be friendly with them and would only at best try to manipulate them into being pawns, which the Chaos Dwarfs are generally too clever for. And I don't think Strigoi and Blood Dragons would be particularly fond of them either. Vampire Coast. No recorded meetings, but otherwise see above as for how vampires and Chaos tend to interact. Maybe the Vampire Coast Navy has encountered the Chaos Dwarf Navy. I highly doubt it. They tend to sail very, very different seas. But you never know. The Southern Realms. The Border Princes have had more than a handful of very nasty, ugly encounters with the Chaos Dwarfs, and are, for the most part, very terrified of them for very good reason. Definitely not on friendly terms with each other. The Chaos Dwarfs have marched their armies into the Border Princes and captured slaves from there on numerous occasions. Others, like Tilia, Astalia, and Araby, have probably never battled against the Children of Hashut in any meaningful capacity. The only way the two would encounter each other is if their navies were meeting on the eastern side of the Southlands, which is just very, very unlikely. I'm sure there's been fights, but, none of notable note. The Eastern Realms. For the Eastern Lands of Men, such as End and Cathay, they have undoubtedly battled elements of the Chaos Dwarfs during their history, and to suffer at the hands of the Dawi Zharr will create a bitter hatred never forgotten. The relationships between those lands are undoubtedly very, very sour. And while Cathay and End are very different lands from their western kin, from what I've read of them, they do not seem to be very partial to slavery. I think Araby is the only nation I know of men off the top of my head that is noted to have a culture of slavery. But End and Cathay would either way not be friendly with the Chaos Dwarfs, just because they would be... There is no doubt that End in particular has suffered the attentions of the Dawi Zharr, and I'm sure that they would look to wipe each other out if they could. Beastmen absolutely despise the Chaos Dwarfs, hate everything about them, and vice versa. They have completely different aims, and Hashut is not acknowledged by the Beastmen as one of the Chaos Gods. Granted, there are virtually no Brayherds at all to be found in the Darklands. There's no Beastmen out there, which makes sense given how hostile the environment is, and there's no forests, which Beastmen generally rely on. The two races only ever meet as part of a mutual Chaos Horde, and most likely in that case there is a big boss ensuring they don't get too close to each other and don't start fighting. But if the Chaos Dwarf Empire, or like a full Chaos Dwarf army, ever bumped into the Beastmen, like actual Brayherds, it would be instant violence. The Beastmen despise all forms of civilization technology, and that is... The Chaos Dwarfs are the concept of civilization and technology, but taken to a perverse and corrupted angle. Greenskins. The most popular and common slave of the Chaos Dwarf Empire, there is said to be millions of Greenskins currently mining away in the Dark Earth in the modern day. As a race that has every reason to bitterly despise the Dawi Zharr, many of their number, however, are more than happy to trade captives and other materials the Chaos Dwarfs desire in exchange for right proper choppas and other such shiny bits. Greenskins are not particularly consistent necessarily with their allegiances, so there are definitely some that are willing to tolerate the Chaos Dwarfs, but most don't, especially because the vast majority, all Greenskins outside of the Hobgoblins, and, even the Hobgoblins, hate Hobgoblins. So, to the extent that the Hobgoblins kind of rely on the Chaos Dwarfs to protect them, if they're in the Darklands. So, yeah, no, definitely enemies most of the time. None of the Greenskins special characters are fond of the Chaos Dwarfs. Grimgor hates them. Azag would totally hate them. Most of the characters would. I think the only Greenskin that would be willing to tolerate them would be Scarsnake, and that's only so he can manipulate them. As to, just a few little tidbits, just to kind of cover some overall things, most races and nations don't know the Chaos Dwarfs exist. They very rarely leave the Darklands, so because of that, they're believed to be a myth by most of the world. And then, just because this question keeps coming up, I'm just going to hit it really hard right now. The whole War of Vengeance and War of the Beard thing happened centuries after the Chaos Dwarfs were separated from the Dawi Empire. I mean, the two races hadn't even met yet. The Dwarves and the Elves had not encountered each other by the time the Chaos Dwarfs were created, with the one exception of when Grimnir bumped into Kalidor Dragon Tamer. So none of that big, famous dwarf and elven animosity comes up between the Chaos Dwarfs and the Elves. They just don't have that history. The Elves most likely would look at the Chaos Dwarfs and be like, ah, dwarves, they bet they hate us. And the dwarfs are just like, who the hell are these idiots? But yeah. And then the last thing, just as part of all the questions that were kind of wrapped into this one, Norscan dwarfs are still dwarfs. They are not Chaos Dwarfs. They don't like chaos. Norscan dwarfs are much more part of the Khazalid Empire. They hate Chaos Dwarfs, and if they saw them, they would absolutely try to murder them instantly. And then the closest ally of the Chaos Dwarf Empire is, I think, undoubtedly the Iron Skin Ogre tribe, followed closely by probably the Warriors of Chaos. So, woo, we went way over time. No goof question today. We're just going to end it there. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time. Bye.